All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second to last show and tell series of this season. My name is April Shepard, and I am chair-elect of Lilly. If you're not familiar what Lilly is, it stands for Lifelong Information Literacy, and we are a group of librarians and information professionals, so you do not have to be a librarian. And we work to promote lifelong information literacy in all levels, so from beginning to end. So if you want to learn more about Lilly, I'm going to put my email in the chat in just a moment. Or if you want to do this whole show and tell thing, it's a really great opportunity. We're already starting to plan for next year's session, so you can shoot me your ideas for that too. Before we begin, I just have a couple quick housekeeping items. The session is being recorded, and I will have the recording sent out to everyone by the end of the week. Maybe tomorrow, but give me till Friday. And then feel free to put your questions in the chat. I'll keep an eye on it so Kale doesn't have to, and we'll try and make sure we get to every question. We're going to do our best at the end. And then now to our speaker. Kale Moffat is the information literacy librarian at St. Martin's University. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. My name is Kale Moffat. As April just said, I'm at St. Martin's University in Lacey, Washington. And before I start, I want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the Squally-Apsh, or the Nisqually tribe, who've been stewards of this land for 10,000 years. And it is my hope that as we work and to learn about whose lands we're on, that we will work to promote the tribal sovereignty of the lands that we're on. Alrighty, so let's get into my presentation here quick today. Alrighty, so I've entitled this presentation, so just a quick kind of overview. I have some prepared statements, slides that I'm going to read from. Please ask questions. Your questions are more important than my planned presentation. And then I'm going to illustrate some slides from a PowerPoint that I use in a workshop on APA citations to try to illustrate some of these concepts. I've titled this presentation a trauma-informed approach because of my interactions with social work faculty and students who introduced me to the concept of trauma-informed care, a conceptual framework to social and health services that challenges traditional assumptions about trauma, acknowledging that it is unfortunately far more common than traditional concepts admit to. Encountering this idea along with the language of the ACR framework for information literacy for higher education urged me to rethink how I conceptualize academic struggles of students that I work with. I want to really quickly also acknowledge and give a big thanks to my colleague, Dr. Laura Sears, in the social work department here at St. Martin's, who looked at my use of the trauma-informed framework and offered some great suggestions on how to present it. So I'm very grateful to her for her time. Historically, it seems that many of us have thought about student struggles using a pathological model. Something is broken in the student that must be fixed. Many of us of a certain age were raised with this model, but it is problematic in that this framework can lead to us discounting the experiences and perspectives of those we work with. I've come to believe that students would benefit from us working with them to help reframe citation and plagiarism issues rather than to quote unquote fix them. Even though I'll be talking about trauma-informed care, I want to think about struggles with academic concepts like plagiarism and citation without using the word trauma, because I don't want to trivialize more intense traumatic experiences and the long-term effects they can have on survivors. To honor them, I will talk about academic struggles by using the term academic stressors. And I hope that this shift in terminology signifies the struggles that students have with these concepts, which do have very real impacts, without trying to equate them with more life-threatening traumas such as domestic violence, community violence, experiencing homelessness, etc. In the past, traumatic events were considered exceptional because they were thought to be rare: war, violent crime, natural disaster, etc. More recently, however, researchers have called attention to the fact that traumatic events are unfortunately rather common. In fact, a key tenet of trauma-informed care states that we should assume that everyone has experienced some degree of trauma. It's not always large-scale trauma like war, famine, domestic or community violence, etc. However, even quote unquote smaller forms of trauma can have very real consequences. This realization has led to a large-scale reconsideration of services in social and health fields about our assumptions about trauma and how it impacts survivors. And I think it can help us in dealing with student concerns as well. The essence of traumatic experiences is that they involve fear for the integrity of the body, that it is threatened by death, bodily injury, sexual violation, etc. Psychologically, trauma can threaten the very concept of the self. Martiller, citing the work of Judith Herman, noted that traumatic events have such an extraordinary effect because they overwhelm ordinary human adaptations to life and force people to confront the extremities of helplessness and terror. Furthermore, traumas can be sudden and cataclysmic, or they can be more ongoing and chronic, and some traumatic reactions are considered complex, meaning that they feature aspects of both cataclysmic and ongoing natures. There are many ways that trauma reactions can show up, too many to go over quickly. So I'd like to consider several that we may encounter with students when talking about citations and their associated framework of plagiarism. For this list, I'm drawing from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration's 2014 document on trauma-informed care, a link to which is in the two-pager handout that I provided. April, did you send that out in the chat?
I did.
Awesome, you rock. Okay, so reactions that we're likely to encounter: hyperarousal, or emotional expressions that seem a bit out of place for quote unquote everyday life, including expressions of anxiety, fear, anger, irritability, feelings of being overwhelmed, or expressions of guilt, shame, or self-blame that may seem a bit exaggerated. Another one is intrusive memories or flashbacks that impede present performance. And fourth one is avoidance behaviors. So again, these are kind of traumatic reactions that we may, or trauma-like reactions that we may encounter with students. In dealing with trauma, there are 6 guiding principles of trauma-informed care that should guide our interactions with students. Safety. Our interactions should be such that we do not further traumatize or re-traumatize people. Trustworthiness and transparency. People need to be able to see where we are going with our interactions. Number 3, peer support. People need to have supportive peers, others who've had similar experiences. Number 4, collaboration and mutuality. Healing is a social process, and people need to be supported in their work. Number 5, empowerment and choice. People need to be a part of planning or carrying out their healing. And number 6, cultural, historical, and gender awareness. People's healing needs to take place in contexts that honor their intersectional identities. Alrighty, so these are the guiding principles. When I talk a little bit about the specific slides that I use, I'm going to try to point out ways that I've tried to incorporate these ideas into my presentation and work with students. I'd like to take a moment to consider the idea of threat to self. A useful way to understand this is through the lens of social construction of the self. Oyserman noted that even early on, theorists of the self concept conceptualized it as a social product that develops through relationships with others and what they see in oneself. This social self is sensed, in the words of George Herbert Mead, indirectly from the particular standpoint of other individual members of the same social group and from the general standpoint of the social group. Dialogical self theory holds that the self is a dynamic multiplicity of I positions that emerge from contact with the environment and is bound to particular positions in space and time, thus allowing the embodied I to move from one position to the other in accordance with changes in situation and time. When I'm talking with students, I like to talk about the difference between, say, interactions with their friends versus interactions with their grandparents or a potential employer as a way to help understand this kind of self-construction. With this embodiment and the self emerging through dialectical relationships with others and the environments, threats to the body constitute threats to our sense of self. Additionally, of course, social relationships usually involve the interplay of social position and power, the positioning of oneself over others, even if it's a benign positioning. Whenever the self is threatened, it naturally responds by trying to reassert itself and to find ways to return to ordinary self positions that offer sufficient safety, security, and relaxation. In the case of students, a significant component of their social identities emerges from their relationship to their instructors or professors, as well as more distant experts in the field and discipline-specific expectations and conventions. These social relationships, even in the best of circumstances, can be hierarchical and consequently have the potential of being non-reciprocal and threatening. If we look at the scholarship on students' perceptions about plagiarism, the context of citation, we find that there are actually some striking similarities between student reactions and other trauma survivors. One of the biggest significant features is the overwhelming presence of fear. Studies on students' perceptions of plagiarism and associated academic stressors have convincingly shown that fear is a dominant theme. Power, for example, conducted semi-structured interviews with 31 students and observed that 30 of them specifically mentioned fear of being caught as a dominant thread in their thoughts about plagiarism. One interviewee reported, quote, "They scared us into thinking we're going to jail. We're going to jail. They made you feel like you're stealing all the time," end quote. Gullifer and Tyson conducted a series of focus groups of students and found they experience a great deal of anxiety over the possibility of being caught and punished, and this is especially the case for unintentional plagiarism. Students expressed concern over plagiarism being, quote, presented as a set of rules and warnings that results in a sense of doom, which can be attributed to the legalistic discourse that positions plagiarism in a language of crime and punishment, end quote. The centrality of fear as an organizing principle of the self and its relationship to the world, of course, is a key feature of trauma-shaped worldviews. McLennan interviewed a student who confessed, quote, "I always have a fear of unintentional plagiarism, even though I think I'm doing the right thing. I don't really think any of us go into it with the intention of cheating," end quote. Hyperarousal is another common reaction to trauma and stressors that I think shows up frequently when working with students. Can any of you think of a hyperaroused or inordinately emotional response from students when you're working with them about citations or plagiarism? I have worked with students whose reactions to citation and plagiarism concerns seemed rather disproportionate. I worked with one young woman I worked with expressed fear that she might not be able to get her degree if she cannot quote unquote master citations. Another student asked whether he could lose his counseling credentials because of incorrect citations in a legal document or article he might publish. I've worked with this student a number of times, and he is a veteran of both Iraq wars who does struggle with PTSD. And when we talked about citations, it seemed he made this connection on his own. He said something along the lines of, I know it's kind of overreacting, kind of paranoid, but then again, I do have PTSD, so I kind of overreact to everything. How many students voice concerns about having to switch from MLA to APA, talking about this switch as a huge cataclysmic kind of change? How many of our students voice concerns over being faced with academic integrity issues over and over and over again? And how many voice complaints that seem to have both kinds of reactions? How many of our students use avoidance behaviors when engaging with citation and using sources? How many students have expressed some variation of, I know I should know this, but ... Statements like this express a sense of shame or self-blame. Again, a very common feature of trauma responses. Furthermore, how many of our students point to past bad experiences with citations that seem to affect their work in the present? This could be expressed in statements like, we're supposed to learn this in high school or first year writing, and I couldn't do it, that's why I hate it. Or, my teacher never really explained it and I got marked down on all my papers. I see these as forms of intrusive thoughts because a past experience intrudes upon and can impede present action. Intrusive thoughts here are interesting because it may not be a concrete experience that impedes the present, but a lack of experience or an incomplete understanding. Several studies have found that inadequate instruction on plagiarism and citation, vague guidelines, and inconsistency among instructors can create great amounts of stress and anxiety among students. Consisting, in the way I think about it, this is a kind of intrusion of negative space, to use a fine art or design metaphor. So it's not something they actually experience or something that students don't understand. It seems that these kinds of experiences challenge students' sense of academic selves, causing some to constantly question their abilities and driving others to defiance as a way of recovering a sense of power, of self. Power locates this challenge to selfhood in power dynamics that exist in academia. She noted that many typical methods for teaching students about plagiarism directly engage questions of power and impaired senses of agency, since students, quote, must acclimate themselves to the idea that their professors have power over their daily lives and ultimately their professional lives in a way that secondary teachers did not, end quote. Poor course performance or punishment for plagiarism can, of course, affect progress in a program or even long-term employability in very real ways. One student reported, I think it's, quote, I think it's scary because it is always in the background, though. It's always in the back of our minds. It is scary because it is something that I know I don't have a complete grasp on, end quote. This comment points at a poignant aspect of this perception of powerlessness. Students feel they are not adequately trained in understanding plagiarism. Recall the negative space idea I just suggested. Power observed that academics often stress that students should not plagiarize, but do not do a very good job of helping students understand why not to plagiarize and how not to plagiarize. Golfer and Tyson found that students were unaware of the broader discourse of scholarship in which they are important stakeholders, a discourse community that, quote, values the ability to correctly attribute sources of knowledge, end quote. The underlying assumptions in this thread seems to be that if students are shown how they are participants in a larger context, they can feel a greater sense of agency and power in their own learning and become more willing to acknowledge how they have relied on others to construct their emerging knowledge. I really like this quote. It's a little bit more of an extended quote, but I think it's powerful and illuminating. So one student said, but I'm just wondering with all this is how much our creativity is cut down by all this. And in some papers that I've written in the past, I've wanted some license to move, to really express stuff. And I've been fearful to do it because of I worry about is that I wonder how marks are going sometimes in the respective, because we're all very cautious, kind of a broken up expression. But this statement exposes a very real, reasonable concern about a central pillar of the self concept, namely creativity. Thus, this statement can be seen as expressing a challenge to the self because the student felt unable to act creatively, felt stifled. When I encountered the framework of trauma-informed care, it helped me think about the struggles these students have a bit differently. The framework is not really a set of practices, but an approach to services that, quote, incorporates knowledge about psychological trauma, end quote, which affects how and where these services are provided. The framework recognizes that surviving traumatic events can lead people to organize themselves in ways that can be counterproductive or even destructive over time, and tries to approach these effects with an adaptive rather than a pathologizing point of view. Survival strategies are seen as adaptations to threat and not as deficiencies in the person. And these adaptations can be associated with affective discomfort. Trauma-informed care also recognizes that survivors of trauma can feel powerless or stigmatized in ways that can impede performance of even basic tasks. The idea behind this approach to care is to recognize the impact trauma can have and deliver services in ways that encourage hope, empowerment, trustworthiness, choice, and collaboration. It's a very empathetic approach, sorry. Once I had encountered trauma-informed care, I returned to the ACRL framework with a proverbial new and hopefully more empathetic set of eyes, finding in its language a way to reframe plagiarism and citation. Scholarship is conversation, for example, was perhaps the most useful frame in this process for me. I'd used the analogy of scholarly conversations before, but I began to think of it less as this abstract process and ask how I could help students see this conversation happening and envisioning themselves as part of it. Common complaints I'd heard is, why are there so many styles? Or why are they making me use APA instead of MLA? So in my presentations, I've tried to start including a review of sponsoring bodies and why we need citation styles. I would hope that professors and instructors talk about citations and why standards and styles exist, but either they aren't or they are doing it in such a way that that students don't get it, which I find completely understandable given the amount of content they need to cover. As librarians, we can play a role in building students' ability to cite correctly to help them overcome these academic stressors. Okay, so over the next few slides, I'm going to show you some slides from an APA workshop that I lead that incorporate strategies from trauma-informed care literature. I may not be able to get through all of them, but I have provided kind of a summary with some of the ideas. I'm currently working on a paper in this presentation, so hopefully y'all can see it soon. Before I go on, are there any questions or observations?
There's just a lot of conversation in the chat right now about the difficulties going from one style to the other style, and how, you know, like you said, you know, students don't always know why they have different styles, but also that we even struggle sometimes to go from one style to the other style. We're trying to teach them. And then there was some conversation about just having one universal style too.
Yeah, it'd be nice if we could do that, but unfortunately there are too many professional interests to do that, I'm sure. Yeah, that one's really one we encounter a lot. And one of the things that I try to do in my APA presentation is point out similarities between MLA and APA, so that students don't feel like this is a totally foreign language. I mean, if students feel kind of comfortable and, you know, conversant in one, start looking for those similarities. And I think there are ways to frame that. And I'll try to point some of those out as I look at these slides. So this is the front slides. So a couple things that I try to do is playfully acknowledge negative emotions and the everydayness of concerns to destigmatize negative feelings. A lot of times students come in and they're already feeling kind of bad about themselves because it is confusing and it's complex. So trying to find ways to diffuse that negative emotion. And one of the things that I do in my presentation, I use decontextualized images from scary films as an extended metaphor to reframe these negative feelings. So this one's, you know, trying to take this scene from, you know, Dracula, the famous Dracula film, and just, you know, trying to diffuse some of that negative feelings. You know, they aren't so scary. And Dak goes, "Doc, are you nuts?" Just a way of acknowledging negative feelings that students may have and the reactions for it. And I use throughout the presentation, I use this kind of metaphor of decontextualized movies, like Frankenstein and things like that. Presenting a roadmap, of course, this is right, a good teaching practice, but this also helps with trauma-informed care because, right, giving transparency and trustworthiness, you know, leading again into that particular need of people working with trauma, right? So just let them know what's coming up. Create an empathetic atmosphere. This one is really, I love this one. This is, you know, we all scream about citations. You know, just again, acknowledging and trying to destigmatize that negative reaction that students have. One of the most effective things that I've found has been talking to students about how, you know, professors have emailed me and said, I'm citing a source that I've never done before. How would I, you know, can you recommend how I should cite this? And it's really interesting to see students' body language just change when they understand that their professors struggle with this as well, that they have their concerns. Another thing I like to do is point out that professors often have to, you know, refer to their, you know, in this case, APA publication manuals to answer questions, or that professors use the Purdue OWL to answer quick questions, right? So kind of giving this sense of, you know, we're all kind of in this together and that we all struggle with this has a huge kind of effect on students. And I've had a number of students just say something like, "Oh my gosh, that's so good to hear that." So acknowledging that, you know, it struggles and difficult for all of us. And then really unpacking the context of scholarly conversations, right? A lot of students know APA has something to do with psychology, except for the psychology students, of course. But, you know, talking about organizational, you know, this is a product of an organization involved in these scholarly conversations. And it's, you know, so that it's not that it's not an anonymous they say I have to do this, but it's really starting to build this context for students. And I like to point out that, you know, it's used extensively in the social sciences. So I point out other areas that are not psychology that use APA, you know, and in student papers and such, right? Business oftentimes is going to use Chicago, business publication against Chicago, but that's higher end, right? I mean, and that's another thing, kind of focusing on what students need for their context. And then I like to really unpack this metaphor of the scholarship as conversation. So I have this slide with the picture of people at a conference, actually having conversation. But then we talk about other places, that these conversations take place through, publications, professional societies, etc. And then, right, to start, I turn that and try to help students understand that when they're asked to write papers or give presentations, they become part of that conversation, even if it's on a very local level. And that has been, that's another point in these presentations where students have, it's really nice to see students' body language change, or like once they see this idea of a conversation happening and they can have a visual associated with it, it becomes much easier for them to see themselves in this process. Right, and so it becomes, right, they can start to see this as a process of exchange, of social exchange. Then I like to, again, that's still kind of abstract. So I have this slide and this, trying to show this happening in papers. So this is a kind of a thread in conversation about gender and media. So, right, so I talk about how, Irving Goffman published gender advertisements in 1979, then showing a paper from 2011 that cites that, and then another paper from 2017 that cites that one. Right, and so showing this thread of how this thinking from Irving Goffman has kind of been adapted in different contexts over time. And I also point out that Goffman was American. The 2017 paper, these are American authors, but the 2011 paper, these are authors from South Africa, right? So reinforcing this idea that scholarly conversations take place over large amounts of time, but also large amounts of space. One of the things I like to do to kind of illustrate that point is, I'll tell students, okay, here is a really important academic question that's really, really important. And then I'll say, you ready for it? And students are like, sometimes, they'll lean forward in anticipation. I said, what is the nature of God? Right. And then we talk about that. How long have people been talking about that? And where have people been talking about that? And it starts to illustrate the kind of large context of these questions. And students have, mentioned and in assessments, they've talked about how that helps them kind of understand the need for citations better. This, to me, is one of the most important aspects of the way I'm trying to approach that. I talked about reframing citations. So I try to use this concept of gratitude framing. We talk to students about shout outs and what's it like to get a shout out from somebody, and what's it like to give a shout out. And I like to point out that our brains, the same parts of the brain that are involved in receiving a compliment and giving a compliment, same parts of the brain are associated. That's why it feels good to give a compliment, at least as good as it is getting that. And so I talk to students a little bit about, what if we think about citations as giving shout outs to other people for helping you learn about the topic. Right, and so right, instead of trying to change it right? Changes the framing, right? From, you know, a stick approach to a carrot concept. And so that way, try to, you know, give students a positive way of reframing their citations. And I point out, you know, even if you want to argue against somebody's points or against the way they're framing an issue, that person has still helped you learn. And it's been, I've talked to students after the fact, and they've told me, you know, kind of anecdotally how much that has kind of helped. You know, and I always acknowledge it doesn't make citations much easier, but if we're doing it for a reason, you know, that kind of reward system, then it makes it easier to deal with. Oh, let me come back here. I also do, you know, bring in, you know, that the fact that there is a you know, I call it the R word, responsibility. There, you know, with citations and plagiarism, there are legal aspects available, and I point out, you know, cases where somebody has been caught plagiarizing, and so it does have a real effect. But then I always kind of bring it back to, but if we think about it in terms of giving shout outs, it makes it much more pleasant rather than doing it out of fear, if that makes sense. I talk about tools. I don't have a lot of time to go into these, but I point out that there are tools available in Word and Google Forms and in Pages. And so, right, again, tools, this idea of how do we, you know, what's something I can use to help tackle this and overcome this stressor. Again, and that plays into the concept of agency and empowerment for students. Cheat sheet, another tool. I always make sure. Right now, this is a University of Calgary has a really nice APA cheat sheet that I like, and so I make sure students get that, and I give that to them before we start talking about citations, so that they can actively look at some examples that are in there. Let me just stop here. I notice there's a lot of activity in the chat. Are there any questions at this point?
So there's some resource sharing going on. A lot of people just talking about citations. And so one thing that came up is, why do faculty use this crime and punishment framework for citations? Where does this like punishment aspect come from?
That is a great question. And I I think there's a couple of reasons for it. I'll be blunt. I think a big part of that comes from kind of the white patriarchal nature of academia, right? This, right? I mean, the patriarchy loves crime and punishment. So I think part of that is it comes from there. I think another part of that just comes from, this is what, you know, many of us have kind of been raised on. So we're, you know, just kind of repeating the framing that we've been given. Again, there also is a very real aspect of crime and punishment with like intellectual property and things like this, but I don't think that's a productive way of talking about it with students, and it's certainly not the most helpful for students, because it creates an atmosphere of fear. That's a great question, and I've thought about that one a lot, and I think those are the big reasons.
You know, one thing I've done in my own classes recently, I say about 2 years I've started this, and I notice a difference in my students, is I talk about citations as a protection and not a punishment. So if you're citing your sources, because there's so many very famous cases of politicians losing their job for something they did 20 years ago, or creative types, or academics of people, their dissertation, and then 30 years later it found out they plagiarized their dissertation. So I tell them it's a protection tool. And so even if you don't like citations, make sure you cite everything, because you're going to ensure the safety of your job. You're going to ensure that you're going to be protected. And I don't get quite as much pushback.
Yeah, I mean, that's another way of framing it. So in classes when I teach, I try to use this gratitude framing, but then talk about other ways of framing it. I think the more we can get away from this kind of fear framing, the better it'll be for students, right? I mean, just if anybody's looked at the positive psychology, the effects of expressions of gratitude is pretty huge, and very helpful. Yeah, whoever asked that question, I appreciate that question a lot, and it's something I have thought about.
And then we have one more question for right now.
Yeah.
Does the framing the context of workshop versus a whole class instruction make a difference in teaching citations in a trauma-informed way?
That's a fantastic question. What I've experienced with students, both anecdotally and also in looking at assessments, is it does seem to help in that students can, I mean, it offers them a way to think about it for themselves. Our school does not have a 1 credit library course. And so I'm trying to lay the groundwork for proposing that. And that's actually one of the things that I'm going to propose to do in part of the curriculum, is talk about citations and really build an understanding of that. Again, because it's right. I mean, you think about your typical class. I mean, there's so much to cover. I have an MA in English, and I was a TA teaching, first year composition. Right. And I remember just from my own experience, just trying to carve out time to talk about citations. And I always felt like there was so much content and pressure to deliver other content that I wasn't able to do it. And I'd really, so I have a lot of empathy for instructors and professors. And so, but I think, my experience with students has been, and I've had students come up a year after the workshop and just see me on campus and say, thanks, this idea was so helpful for me. And, thanks for that workshop. So I think it can have some effect. I think it would have greater effect if we could spend more than a workshop on it. I love that question.
Okay. That's the only question for the moment.
Okay. Let me share a couple other slides. I'm trying to be cognizant of time here. So another one, teaching patterns and really simplifying the patterns, like for APA, right? This is the basic pattern, last names, comma, year, comma, page numbers, and you don't always have to have page numbers. And so we talk about that, and we talk a little bit about a couple of quick variations on that, right? So they're just getting work with the very, very basic pattern and move right from that into a verbal exercise. And and students will do this verbally. They'll work together. If I have larger groups, which occasionally happens, have them break into pairs, and they can talk about this. So I give them, right, so this is a paraphrase, giving them the author's name, the year, and page number. And so students will kind of verbally compose the citation, right? And this is what most come up with, because they point out there's not a direct quotation. And it's like, yeah, right. I mean, if you're not using direct quotation, you don't need the page number. But then I talk about how APA encourages that, but doesn't really require it. And so right? So there's at that point, again, coming back to the 6 guiding principles, right? Empowerment and choice. So letting students see, okay, I have a choice here. I can either just go with author's name and year, or I could be a little bit more pointed in my citation. And then we talk about the variations of patterns. So try to get them comfortable with the basic pattern first, and then, okay, what are some of the patterns that they're variations that they're likely to encounter, and I try to be, humor I think is important. So bland corporation, dorky page, and I've had a couple of older, non-traditional students, so Larry, Curly, and Moe. So, Three Stooges, right? But I mean, just bringing in kind of ways that you can bring a little bit of humor in there. Again, it kind of diffuses that negative energy that surrounds citations a lot. Okay, this one, students really like this one. I give them an organizational scheme for end citations so that students can decipher end citations. And I point out that almost all APA references answer these 4 questions in this order. Who made it? When was it made? What is it? And where can I find it? Right, a very simple pattern, and this holds up for most APA citations. And then I point out an example. Who made it? When was it made? What is it? Where can I find it? So this is an isolated example, then show them a more contextualized example from a paper that I was working on several years ago. Again, so they can kind of see this. And I try to talk to students a number of times about this and try to get them to repeat the pattern, who made it, when was it made, what is it, and where can I find it? And I found, and this is a again, this is one of the things that students have talked about most to me about this presentation. This modular approach makes it much easier to think about how to read citations and understand citations. And we point out, right, in some variations, right, this thing on slide on variations on the patterns. I talk to them about how sometimes the what is it, if we're citing by a web page name, for example, the what is it is going to be first. So it becomes, what is it, when was it made, and where can I find it? For those kinds of positions, right? It's a government report, right? It's going to be, right? So I use the example of, what if we have 3 citations from the CDC in our paper, right? And so we can't cite Center for Disease Control for all of them. So use page name. So then it becomes, what is it? When was it made? Who made it? Center for Disease Control, and then where can I find it? And that's really the biggest variation that there is. I also like to point out that for the most part, students in end citations really use a limited number of sources, articles, book chapters, sometimes full books, online videos, web pages, right? So just again, this idea of, trying to address this feeling of being overwhelmed. Don't feel like you have to master on a big number of sources. Here's several patterns that you will need to work with, and just kind of leave it there. And again, also inviting them, look, if you have a question about citations, talk to your professor, or please feel free to email me. Again, making ourselves a tool that students can use. And then kind of once we go over these, give them collaborative verbal exercises. So I'll just right? I've just taken citations, broken them out into modular chunks, and students will verbally put them together. Here again, I really kind of go at that pattern of, the 4 questions. Who made it? When was it made? What is it? Where can I find it? In the second one right here that we can see here, right, this is an example of an article in West Encyclopedia of Law there's not an attributed author. So here's where we get to talk about this example of, okay, here's a time when this pattern changes. Last of all, invite feedback. This again plays into concepts of agency and empowerment. And I've gotten some great feedback from students, hey, this still seems unclear, or, I've had some students say, could you talk about this maybe next time a little bit more? And really, and I try to communicate to students that for me, actually, their suggestions are the part of the feedback that I'm most interested in and really try to pay attention to. And I think that's about it. Here's references. I added these to the handout that I gave.
And there are also several resources that have been shared in the chat. So I will share those with you. And then when I send out the recording, I'll send that out to everyone too.
Oh, that would be awesome.
Yeah, there's some really good stuff coming up. So this is my question here. This is mine. And we talked a little bit in the chat too about citation builders. Students are so used to citation builders. So I've kind of taken personally a approach of not trying to make them stop using the citation builders, but frame the citation builders as a starter tool. Like we talk about why they will be wrong, why you need to check them, but how they can be a template, but then you need to go in and kind of not fighting against the fact that they're already used to working with them.
Yeah, Natalie, I just saw trust but verify. I like that. The way I like to frame that for students is that citation builders or machine generated citations, I introduce that term to them. Machine generated citations do 80% of the work. Our 20%, I'll point out, for example, the indentation will always be incorrect. So we've got to indent correctly. So just knowing that going in. And then I'll point out, so oftentimes I'll pull up a citation and we'll look at it. And most of the time there's something a little bit off. So we can talk about, okay, for example, I've seen some machine generated citations where the algorithm isn't correct, and so it'll be supposedly APA, but it'll give the full author's full first name and say, okay, here in APA this is correct for MLA, but APA we just need the author's first initial. So just trying to really demonstrate that 20% work that we need to do on top of that.
I do a lot of our discovery service and our databases that have the built-in citation builders. I explain how they work, and I will do searches with purposely misspelled words to first show that these things will show up because someone misspelled in the any of the records in, and then when the citations get built, they're still misspelled in the citations.
Yeah, and I try to point out that they're pulling from descriptive data about the item. So if that descriptive data is not input correctly, then the citation's not going to be correct.
Yeah. There's a real life person who types something in somewhere.
Yeah, or it harvested metadata, but somebody wrote that code and sometimes that code doesn't work properly.
It's corrupted. Yes, we talk about that.
Yeah.
At the very beginning, when you first started, there was a comment, but I thought this would be worth a few minutes. As Do we think that the plethora of AI apps will affect students' feelings with citations?
That's a really good question. And I haven't, so I'm on a kind of working group on my campus on, how are we going to approach talking about AI apps and Chat GPT and things like that. One of the things that I've provided professors with is showing I asked Chat GPT to develop a list of possible of sources that I could look at for something a paper I'm looking at right now. And all but one source were completely made up. So, understanding I think it'll help to students to understand kind of the framework of AI. AI begins with an initial state, and with Chat GPT, that initial state goes up to 2019. But also understanding the G in it, generative. It's creating stuff, right? It's making shit up. So, yeah, so I think that's a really important question to talk about, and it's pretty complex. I think the best thing is to be pretty open with students and understand what's happening with it right now. And so we have a professor on campus in the engineering department who's it's really cool. He's offered several kind of handouts and discussions to see how it to demonstrate how this works. To the extent that we know, right? The other thing is AI, it's a black box. Sometimes it makes leaps of logic that we can't explain.
Yeah, we've had two cases in my library, one in archives and one in interlibrary loan, where a student had a citation that we eventually figured out was generated through Chat GPT, and then we had explained that didn't exist. And
yeah, it's a whole interesting new world to talk about. And I've been thinking about it more in the terms of kind of paper composition than citation. So I haven't really sat down and really looked at how it can affect citations and things. I'm teaching a class in the fall, and I'm co-teaching a class in the fall, and my co-teacher and I, we're gonna take a couple of moments. We're gonna take a class period, and we're gonna talk about kind of some of the problems with these tools, and how they actually can undercut students' lifelong. If we get too enamored with these tools and too dependent on these tools, is counterproductive in the long run. Try to give them a lifelong learning perspective.
Exactly. All right, so I don't see any other questions. It's a really great chat, though. I will make sure to share that with you.
Please.
But thank you for talking with us. This was really good.
Thank you so much. And for those who signed up in March, I'm sorry, I accidentally put the wrong time down. I put the Central Time, not the Pacific time. So that's on me.
I'm glad that's all it was. Thank you.
Thanks much. I appreciate it. Thank you all for listening in. April, see you in a couple weeks.
In a couple of weeks, yeah.